Carter, who has a beautiful show up at Barry Campbell right now. And she did a wonderful talk at Almond recently, and there's probably a million more talks in the future that you keep track of. And Donnamarie Barnes, who's the director of history at Sylvester Manor, and also is the co-director and director of the Plainside Project. She did a series of talks here in 2020 with David Rattray about that project, which I highly encourage you to check out and spend a lot of time on their website, which is fascinating. And that's all I'm going to say, so you can enjoy a good talk. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. So, good afternoon. Thank you again for coming on this beautiful day. And welcome to Duck Creek. And as Jess said, I'm Donnamarie Barnes, and I'm in my other capacity today as a photographer and artist, as opposed to a director of history. I'm telling stories about the history of enslavement and free people of color of the East End, but you'd be surprised how it all sort of melds together. Nanette and I have been friends since we were teenagers, as the photo shows. Once upon a time, we were girls on a beach in Sag Harbor. Nanette grew up in Sag Harbor Hills, and I grew up in Nineveh Beach in what we call the Sands communities of Sag Harbor. Sag Harbor Hills, Azurest, and Nineveh developments. This was from the 1950s, late 1940s. You'll have to excuse me, I'll get dates and I'll put them in the 19th century because that's what I do in my other life. So no, it was not 1848, it was 1948. That African American professionals started to come to the East End, to Sag Harbor, to buy property and to build homes in these three communities. And that's the environment that Nanette and I grew up in. And our life really revolved around being at the beach. And within that growing up, of being in that community, of being surrounded by other African American families who would come from the city, we were children all together, sharing everything, traditions, and out of that grew a culture that persists to today, to the third and fourth generations. And it was within that growing up that both Nanette and I became exposed to artists who lived in the community, were friends with our parents whose work we were aware of, including our beloved Frank Wimberley. And that's really the basis of the talk that we're going to give today about how growing up in Sag Harbor on the East End has influenced us as artists and as women. And so the photographs that will accompany this talk are more or less our history on this subject. As I said, we were girls on a beach. It's been a lot of fun, sort of like digging back into our archive to find these gems. Yeah. Moving on. In the
yes, I'm gonna actually. I wanted to talk about this particular point in time, if we could. Driving out to Sag Harbor in the 60s and 70s, you probably took Route 27, made a left at Sag Harbor Turnpike, and as you progressed to the left, you probably saw what looked to be a shanty town of itinerant African-American workers who would come out in the summer to work on the farms, to also work in the mansions. And these were homes that had no insulation. These were homes that many times had outhouses. They clearly were only lived in during the warm months, but these were very poor people. Riding through Sag Harbor Turnpike, those days, it looked to me as though it was Mississippi. It could have been anywhere in Georgia or Alabama, right here in Bridgehampton. But on the right side of the street was this very small building, which was the Bridgehampton Daycare Center. And it was at the daycare center that their children, as they were working and laboring, would come to learn how to read, have organized sports. There were lots of toys there that were donated. And they also were fed. They were given breakfast and lunch. There was a wonderful fiber artist who lived in our community, Dorothy Woody, and she lived in Azurest on the beach. She had a beautiful perch there looking at the bay. And she knew about the strong artistic community that we had, and she approached all of the artists at the time. Donnamarie was one, Frank was one, I believe Edith Jones, some of you may remember Edith Jones, who was in Sag Harbor Hills. Several folks she approached and said, let's have a fundraiser for the daycare center. And she had it in her home. And that went over so well that the next year, actually this is the next year, this is actually then, and we believe the Dorothy Woody show was around 1976. The next summer was 1977, and we had it at Richard Clark's home. Richard Clark was in Nineveh. He had another wonderful perch up on the bay, looking out on the water, absolutely stunning. This is his back porch, and these are several of the artists. And let me just tell you that Frank Wimberley is there. Let's see, starting to the top on the right is Carl Sheely. Going over to the left, the next one is Frank Wimberley. Next to Frank is Al Loving. Next to Al Loving is, tell me who that is.
That's Roz.
Roz Letcher. Oh my gosh, she looks so different. My gosh, yes. Roz Letcher. Next to Roz is Bill Hudson. Next to Bill Hudson is
Bob.
Is that Bob Freeman? Oh my God, it's so
Your brother-in-law.
Bob Freeman. Yes, okay. Ducking down in that white top on the left, that's me. Very thin, delicate. Richard Clark is the gentleman in the center with the blue pants. Donnamarie is sitting right next to him, and photographer Dale Jenkins is right above Donnamarie. So that was us. We did our group shot. You can sort of see the water in the background to the right. But let me just tell you quickly about Richard Clark, because he had what was the Richard Clark Associates in New York City, which was an executive recruiting agency. He was sort of a headhunter for corporate black folks who were trying to get jobs. He did extremely well. He befriended, I believe, Romare Bearden early on in his life, fell in love with art, and began a collector himself. He began to collect art. And he decided he wanted to have a sale at his home. Here he is again, Richard Clark. That summer, I think because Al Loving was in the show and he was fairly well known as that point, let me just say very quickly, Al Loving was the first African American to have a solo show at the Whitney Museum, 1969. So all of these wonderful folks had gathered together. The fundraising was wonderful, and Elaine Benson of the Elaine Benson Gallery in Bridgehampton came to the show. And she said that she wanted to do something with a few of us later on, and we said, okay, we'll see. You know, at this point, we are not being seen in any of the white galleries at the time. I think maybe Frank was the only one who was being shown in the Hamptons. And then we went on to the summer of 78. Oh, this is the list, sorry, of artists. If you could read that for us.
So in 1978, we had another collective show, again to benefit the Bridgehampton Child Care Center, with myself, Nancy Brannon, Nanette Carter, Robert Freeman, Albert Henriquez, Roberta Hunter, Harlan Jackson, Edith Jones, Alvin Loving, Rosalind Letcher, Carl Sheely, and Frank Wimberley.
So the group had really grown at this point in terms of who was exhibiting. Again, went extremely well. And we could move to the next slide. I hope you all can see that. That's a woodcut. All right. I actually created the woodcut, printed it, and then put it all around Sag Harbor, advertising this particular event. And this year we had it at the daycare center. We took down all the children's works, all the toys, and just made it into a huge gallery, and it worked out really fabulously. Anyway, that very same summer, Elaine Benson chose Al Loving, Roz Letcher, and myself to show at her gallery. And I do believe that was the first time she had shown African American artists. Harlan may have actually shown before that. I need to check on that because he had been in Eastham for quite some time. But we showed at the Lane Benson Gallery, and really due to the show at Richard Clark's home, go to the next one, there was a focus on Roz Letcher, who was a painter, and myself for the Women Artists News, 1978. And the next one. And I'm going to read this for you. It's very, tiny there, but basically it says East End artists. So Donna and I believe this was a point in time where we decided to call ourselves the East End artists. This is 1978. So the title is East End Artists, Nanette Carter and Roz Letcher. And one of the quotes, and that's our phone going on there. One of the quotes read, "We didn't come together because of one idea. We came about through the need to talk and show our work." Ray Farron wrote this particular piece, and at the time Ray Farron was the director of exhibitions at Guildhall. She was also a painter, and she was the wife of a very famous artist, John Farron, who is in Guildhall, Parish Museum, and the like. And then I believe it was the fall of 1979 that Guildhall approached Al Loving and asked him to curate a show of the artists of the East End, and we then changed our names to Eastville Artists. And again, this is 1979. It was in the fall, so it wasn't at the time the height of, where people are coming in and visiting the museum, but we were in Guildhall. And we believe we had our last show, our last fundraiser, around 2005 for the Daycare Center. And this particular show, I know that Candace Montgomery, who's here in the audience, was there. She exhibited. And basically the same roster of people that we've been seeing all along.
Yes, including John Penderhughes and Michael Butler, I believe.
Yeah.
So through these years and these decades of us coming together in Sag Harbor in the summer, being back at the beach, bringing the artistic work that we were doing all the year long, we found a way to share it with our community, to be influenced by the community, and to benefit the community in a collective kind of way. And that was a very important sort of tradition that we had started, that we continue today. Last summer we had another art show at Jennifer Segre's, whose father had been one of our original artists, at her home for the community of artists. That was benefit for the Eastville Historical Community Center Society. This is you.
Okay, actually, we're going to go on now to what's happening today, okay, in terms of our lives as artists. This is my work right now, hanging at the Barry Campbell Gallery in Chelsea. And the two larger works that you're looking at are from a new series. It's called Stabilizing. I feel that living in the 21st century has been quite destabilizing, especially recently. And there's some seats. Come on in. There's seats over on the other side there. Yep, excellent. Come on through. And so the work is, I think, has a sense of movement and tension. And again, I'm really trying to hit on the zeitgeist of today, of how folks are feeling, the tensions, the question as to whether or not democracy is going to be able to continue in this land, and the difficulties that we're involved with in terms of COVID and so many other things that are happening now. So the series is really coming from that. This is a piece that's in a different group, but I usually work with about 3 different series simultaneously, which is crazy, but I can
Talk about your medium.
Hmm?
Talk about your medium.
Yes, and this is actually a series that's called Black and White, and my medium is oil on mylar. And Mylar is plastic, so it's going nowhere. And I'm working on a frosted sort of texture in the Mylar, which is trapping the paint in. And I'm collaging. And I have to say that it was Frank Wimberley who really kind of started me off there with collaging, especially on the scale that he works with. I like to say my first studio was on my bed in my home. I would create and collage on my bed at the age of 8, 9, 10. But when I was 13, I saw Frank's work out here in the Hamptons, in Sag Harbor. And I fell in love with his work, and I saw his work at the Peter Lunum Gallery, which was in Bridgehampton. Back in the day, he was again the only one that was showing out here in the gallery situation. And I just felt such a kinship with him, being an abstract artist myself, not dealing with figuration. So I just, looking at his work, I was friendly with his son, and would go by the home and just love to see all that was going on. He always changed. Each summer there was a different work on the walls. Just beautiful home. He also did sculpture, which would be on his porch that he built. He built a deck there off of his home. And then, of course, Al Loving, the wonderful collage artist who would rent out here. I met Al at Guildhall back around in the late, 76 or so when all this was going on. And the next slide. This is an older piece from the 80s. This is a piece from a series called Illumination. And it's actually oil pastels on museum board. I'm going to do a little PR work right now. I'm going to be in a show at the Eric Firestone Gallery, which opens May 28th. That's a Saturday. And it's a group show of women showing works from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And the body of work that I'll be showing is from the series Illumination. And Illumination really came out of my travel to South America. I went to Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, and I was just amazed at the African retention in South America, that slavery was very different in the South Americas. You could actually hold on to a lot of your religious ideas, and the drum was a big factor, music was a very big factor. And so I did this series called, because it was so illuminating to me, being there and witnessing the artwork that clearly was influenced by African art, the music, the different tempos when you think about the samba, bossa nova, just amazing rhythms. And so a lot of the work, I think, has this sense of movement. And again, this series will be in that show called Hanging, Leaning, Women Artists on Long Island, 1960s to 1980s. Again, Eric Firestone, right here in East Hampton. And then August 7th, for those of you who go out to Martha's Vineyard, I'll be at the Featherstone Gallery in another group show of women. And August 15th, I'll be right here at Ashwag Hall. Barry Campbell Gallery will be showing some of her artists here in East Hampton at Ashwag Hall. So that's my PR.
And this is me. So I've been a photographer since I was a teenager and started photographing at the beach. So this is a piece of from up on the bluff at Nineveh Beach from the 1980s. And as Nanette said, growing up, we were always very aware of Frank Wimberley as being the artist in the community, and going to his house was an occasion. And there was always a just drop by kind of policy. And for Nanette and I, because we were becoming interested and involved with art, finding our own creative expression, going to talk to Frank became a part of our summer, because his door was always open, he was always encouraging and supportive and wanted to see what you're working on. And it was just the atmosphere that you were with a working artist, that as young people just finding our visions, it was very, very inspiring and continues to be. And the beach for me has always been my subject. I did a lot of street photography in the 80s, living in the city, but I'm always called back home. And now I live full-time in Sag Harbor. And because of the work that I do, the history work that I do about the history of enslaved and free people of color of the East End, of Sag Harbor, of Shelter Island, this is the land that they lived in. These are the waters that they worked in, experienced. And so for me, it's not just anymore about it being our beach, where we had all of our teenage adventures. It is the place of my spirit and the place of my creativity. And over the years, maybe more influenced by Frank than I recognized, or at the moment, it has sort of evolved into being a little bit more expressionistic. A sunset is a beautiful sunset every day. But sometimes you have to look a little bit deeper, and sometimes I'm called to find answers to things that are going on, questions within my own self, and the beach soothes me, settles me, and answers me. And you never find the same thing twice. And then there's, as we say, then there's Frank. On his deck, I spent a period of time with him about 4 or 5 years ago, photographing him and a lot of his work at both his home in Queens and here in Sag Harbor. And that was a very precious time to spend together, to really work with him and to have him talk directly about the work that he was doing, organizing it. He was about to be represented by the Barry Campbell galleries, and so we were photographing the work to sort of send out, as examples. And he's always a great subject. And then this was here 2 weeks ago, right here in that corner. And so it feels like we've come full circle. So when Nanette asked me to do this talk with her today, it's a great honor. Frank could not be here because he's in Queens, and getting out is a little bit arduous for him. But he was very honored that we were going to be here to represent this history and to tell these stories. So again, this, the coming together of the East End artists, the Eastville artists, to showcasing our work to benefit the community has been a tradition for well over 40 years that I think will continue as long as we have work to show and to share not just within our immediate community, but with the wider community of the East End of Long Island. Having this space to show work. Jess doesn't know it yet, but we are scoping it out for future. As a place to give talks and to just sort of come together in this community. The Sands community where we live and grew up has diversified over the years, and I think the inclusion of that this is where we all live, this is the work that I do, the history work, is about that this has always been a diverse community from the very founding of the place. And to be representative of that, to reflect that history is something that's incredibly important to me. And that we teach each other what that history is and celebrate it. Because there is a lot to celebrate. We talked a little bit about the Turnpike in Bridgehampton, the history of that, of the migrant workers that lived there, who then went on to become full-time residents, whose descendants live there still, as part of the greater community. There aren't just pockets of people here. We are one people. This is one history of the East End of Long Island. I say that all the time. This is not about Black artists. This is about artists of the East End who make their homes here, who have been here for generations. And so, again, we've been very happy to give you this little brief introduction to the work that we do and the places that we've come from, and we'd love to hear conversation questions.
I want to hear more of the story. How can you carry this forward? And is anybody now kind of leading the Eastville artists as a group? Are you still,
Well, I think, we were a semi-organized group in the day. We were all here for the summer, our families were here, and so it was sort of a natural coming together. And again, that is continuing. We had a community exhibition last summer,
And
we'll have another one this year.
For next year, this year, and it's gonna continue.
And it will
on,
continue.
yeah. And I think the other thing too is that, Diane, and I'd love to tell you the story about Diane in just a minute. I think that we're being accepted now into the wider community, as Donnamarie's talking about, showing at Guildhall or Eric Firestone in my instance. I was just at the Parish Museum in that show. So I think that there's a bit more of an embracing of our work now. Eric Firestone is centering around women who are from Long Island, from this area, in his show. And so I believe I might be the only African American, but things are beginning to open up. They certainly are. And I think that our community will always have these art fairs, because what we're finding is that there are young artists who are coming along and want to also participate, and also people that we can mentor, begin to have our own mentees to bring things along and keep things moving. So I think there's always going to be that core, but I also feel that, we're seeing a lot of different changes at Parish, at all the galleries, and I do have to tip my hat off to Elaine Benton, and I do believe Harlan Jackson was the first African American to show in her gallery back in the early 70s. In fact, I believe he's in the collection of Guildhall and maybe even the Parish. Wonderful abstract art. People, please take a look at Harlan Jackson. He died, I believe, in the 90s or so. But, so I think that things are changing for sure. I think for the better, but the community is going to be the community too.
Yes.
And certainly because we have Eastville Historical Society that's there, we've got several causes that we can raise money for. I think that at the time working with the Daycare Center just happened to work out so famously. We had a couple of people that actually in our community that ended up running the Daycare Center. Henry Letcher, some of you may know. He ended up running the Daycare Center. So we really partnered quite a bit with them. And they now have, I believe, an extension. It's really a community center. Adults are going there also.
yeah.
This is
They
growing.
rebuilt it.
Yes.
It's beautiful.
It's incredible.
And I might
Yes.
add, because I'm a teacher, that many students go after school.
After school
And such a vital
programs.
part of
Yeah.
family existence for them. After school,
Yeah.
from Bridgehampton, Sag Harbor, it's a vital community. And I'd like to know how you saw, an institution in need so long ago.
And again, this was Dorothy Woody,
Yeah,
a
that's
wonderful woman
fantastic.
who lived in Azurest. It was her idea, she was the one. And again, that's what sort of galvanized us as artists. And we began to really sort of connect then, because there were people, I was not in that first show, okay? And I lived there, and I don't think they knew I was an artist. I wasn't known yet, I was young. Donnamarie, I think your family had been here already, and you had gotten to know the community. So then they pulled me in. That next year I was in it, and very much involved in organizing it for Richard Clark's home. The two of us were very much involved as young people organizing that show. Yeah. I saw some other hands there, yes.
Hi, I just want to amplify the fact that the tradition of community art shows in support of institutions is continuing. As Donnamarie mentioned, last year we had our first Celebrating Community Creatives in Sag Harbor Hills to benefit the Eastville Community Historical Society. And Candace was in it, Donnamarie was in it, Sharon Brown is here someplace, was in it. And this year it's on August 27th, mark your calendars. This is an ad. August 27th, 2 to 6 at 56 Beach Avenue in Sag Harbor. It's an art sale, and I have to say, we also have a book signing because we feel that the authors and poets in our community are very important. So we have a number of authors lined up, and Donnamarie will be in the show again. Frank Wimberley was in last year, and he actually attended and had a piece there. We hope he'll be physically able to come again. So please mark your calendars, and it's called Celebrating Community Creatives, and we did get covered in dance papers. If you want to see me afterwards, give me your email and make sure you know about it. But it is benefiting the Southampton African American Museum this year.
Excellent.
So we're spreading the wealth, and
Olivia, this is your baby? Are you organizing
it is
this?
my baby with Jennifer Segray. I mean,
Awesome.
we're really happy to start this tradition
Yeah.
up again. So,
Thank you, Olivia.
make a note of it. That's the end of the ad. Thank you.
That's good.
Yes, T.
I was just thinking of, I was very pleased to see Rosalind Letcher there,
Yes.
and I have no idea what's happening with her work now that she's not able to paint anymore. Does anyone have any
As far
idea?
as I know, her work is being administered by a friend of hers.
In DC, and I can give you the Frank
Yeah.
name, because she is wondering what to do with all
Yeah,
of these
and
pieces.
we did
Yeah.
have a conversation, I
Yeah.
put her in touch with Georgette Gerke at Eastville about possibly having an exhibition of Roz Letcher's work at Eastville,
Well, there
so.
was a possibility of Keys Gallery being interested
Yes.
as well, so.
Yes.
Well, and Eric Firestone, who likes to show work of that era,
Yeah.
you know.
So
80s,
we'll
60s.
Yeah,
talk
we're good.
I did tell her about Eric Firestone too.
Yes.
Camille.
Yes, Frank often talks about the influence of jazz on his work. I
Yes.
was wondering if you might talk a bit about that and the influence of jazz on your work.
Yeah, definitely. Again, going over to Frank's home, you would always hear jazz playing. And I think that the rhythms and this whole musicality certainly can be seen visually in his work. I think there's a sense of syncopation and movement. I love the way that he builds up his surfaces. I could just imagine this crescendo of different, instruments playing and performing. I think that he knew quite a few of the jazz musicians too. I kind of recall him talking about, I'm trying to think of the guy's name now, a piano player who used to back up Benny Carter. Oh gosh. No, anyway, I do believe he had direct connections with a lot of the musicians. But again, you definitely see that in the work.
Yeah. As Nanette said, going to Frank's house, even to this day, is about listening to the music, of being influenced by the music. Even recently, going over, he sometimes has trouble with his computer because he's got too many windows open, and he'll say to me, like, Miles is playing from someplace, I don't know where it's coming from, but I want him to stop. And so having that, and because I think we grew up in an era where our parents, our fathers were very involved and interested in jazz, that was always that was the soundtrack really of our lives. And so becoming creatives, those rhythms, those patterns, that syncopation, I think had a great influence. I know that it still does. I'm finding that rhythm. When I did do primarily just black and white work and had my own darkroom, I couldn't print if I didn't have jazz playing. One goes with the other. So.
Yeah, and I also work with music, with jazz in particular. Yeah, a lot of work. And I think certainly the sense of movement is carried over into my work. Yeah.
Great question.
Let me just say one other thing though, because he did like R&B and he did like to dance. And I have this story I love to tell. Some of you have heard this already. When I first started to come out as a teenager, going to the beach by myself without my parents, the idea was that you met to find out what the party was for that night, who was having the party. You had to go to the beach on Saturday to find out what was happening Saturday night, and sometimes it was maybe just playing cards, bid whist, or whatever. But you had to go to the beach to find out what home to go to. This particular Saturday on the beach, no one had a party. And Walden Wimberley, who we all at the time called Wim, said, come to my house. I'm not having a party, but my parents are having a party. And because we have these glass door windows, it'll be dark, they can't see us, and we can look at them and we can have great fun and laugh and mimic them and just have a good time. So we all went over, you know, it was my first time going to his home. Again, I had not been back in the woods. He lived in the woods back then. There were not a lot of homes around him.
Right.
I had not gone to that
And the
home.
roads were not paved.
No, these were sandy roads. So he told me how to get there. I went back there, all of us lined up on the grass, looking at these folks doing these really spastic dances, but it was R&B. It was James Brown. It was, all the tunes of the day. But what startled me was the artwork. I wasn't even looking at the parents dancing after a while. It was this abstract artwork all on the walls. I was like, who are your parents collecting? Who is this artist? And Wim said, no, that's my dad. I said, all of these paintings on these walls, he says, those are all my dad. At the time, he was doing what I would call geometric abstractions. Really very beautiful, definitely a colorist. I mean, as you could know, he's definitely a colorist. And I just said, Wim, I've got to meet your dad, and that's how I actually met Mr. Wimberley, was through his son.
Who we never actually called Mr. Wimberley.
No, we didn't. It was always
No, he
Frank.
was the one adult
Yeah.
friend of our parents. In the day you had to call everybody Mr. and Mrs. or aunt and uncle. In Sag Harbor, everybody was your aunt or uncle. But Mr. Wimberley was never Mr. Wimberley. He was always Frank, or he was Wim.
And his wife was Juanita.
And when his wife was Juanita.
Juanita and Frank.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any other questions? Yes.
You talked a little bit earlier, raising a emerging artist who's in college right now and has a lot of things about her career and how to support herself. What kind of advice do you have for the young kids who are probably up for 20, 21, 22, they're either lots of student loans and debt, and want to be able to sort of have this lifestyle that they become accustomed to out there at Sands or the Hamptons, and also want to be able to work as an artist. Like, what's the advice now for people coming up?
It's so interesting because when I was coming up in the early 70s, getting ready to go to college, I was in college from 72 to 76. My parents' friends thought they were crazy sending me off to school to major in fine art. An African-American woman, you're going to spend all this money to send this child to Oberlin College in Ohio to study to be a fine artist? And at the time, I think the only female fine artist that we knew was Elizabeth Catlett. Even Alma Thomas, who was alive and well, was not as well known. And I remember my parents' friends saying, Francis, what are you thinking? This is. My mother said to them, and she was a teacher, she can teach. She can teach because she's got to eat, and I want her out of my house. She's paying for her college degree, that's right. And so when I went to Oberlin, I really, in my mind, felt that I would end up teaching art. What I did do is I did end up going to graduate school, though, right after Oberlin. I went to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn and had a part-time job and took out a student loan, and I paid for my way through graduate school. But it was always this idea that you could teach. That was one of the things. And the other thing, too, is to maybe if you aren't able to sell the work right away, which is very difficult to do right out of undergrad, is to come up with some sort of cottage industry, something that you can mass produce. If you've got printmaking skills or whatever kind of skills you have, that maybe, sewing or whatever, just some kind of cottage industry that can keep you in your studio and keep you going. Now, mind you, when I was teaching, because I went right from Pratt to really a nice job teaching printmaking and drawing at a private school in Englewood, New Jersey, Dwight Englewood School. I was young, so I would come home from teaching, take an hour nap, and from maybe 6 to 11 at night, I'd be in the studio. You know, so I had 2 jobs.
Yeah.
I was working 2 jobs. And it was because of those 2 jobs, because I was still making art, that around the 4th or 5th year that I was teaching at this school, I had actually about 4 different galleries across the country that were selling my work. And so after 9 years of teaching, I quit and actually lived off of the sales of my work for 17 years. But you know, you've got to start, you're just not going to come out of school selling art. You know, so if you can think of some other way to then also, and of course if you're still young, that also helps, have those 2 jobs, balance those 2 jobs out if you can. You've got to keep working. The idea is to stay in the studio. That's the idea.
Yeah. My story is similar. When I graduated from Cooper Union School of Art, my parents said, okay, now what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to Europe to shoot. And they said, oh, that's lovely. So I had saved some money and I was going to Europe for 6 months to take photographs. That lasted 2 months. And then they said, now you're going to have to get a job. Because this, oh, I'm going to be an artist and get an apartment in East Village thing is really not going to work. Because again, art school doesn't really teach you how to make a living, they teach you how to make art. And how you come up with supporting your art and supporting your life is actually, for me, is in reflection, I think a part of making the art. It's part of the creativity because you're creating this creative life. And what, for me, it became, I also did teach, I taught photography with Roy DeCarava at Hunter College. I became a photo editor at Essence Magazine, and then I became a photo editor at an international news photo agency. Editing other people's work while continuing to work on my own. I then became a photo editor at People Magazine. And when we were trying to figure out what was the date of that last exhibition that we had at the Daycare Center, I said, I don't really remember the date, but I do remember, even though I was selling the pieces that I had exhibited that day, I had to leave because I had to go home to my internet connection to negotiate with the paparazzi about an exclusive photograph of Jennifer Aniston. So whatever year that was that she was in vogue, it could have been 2005, that was how I was balancing my life, that I was doing my own photography, making my art, following my practice, but making a living being a photo editor, dealing with paparazzis. I don't do that anymore. So, any other questions?
Can I interject something about the youngsters? One of the things I think that they don't realize at that age is that they're still training their eye at their day job. If you can find a job that is somehow in the realm of what you're making, all that work, teaching, editing, all that business is you're still learning, you're still, exercising that muscle while you're at your paid work.
Exactly.
And you can also send your daughter here if she's interested in a job.
There you go, wonderful.
See, networking, it's working.
Yeah,
Community.
the summer jobs.
Yes. Well, any other questions? Otherwise, thank you again so much for joining us.